Folks, we got a new expansion. It's Scholomance Academy, and a bunch of new cards were already revealed. So we're going to review them. We're going to talk about them. We're going to say whether they're good or bad, and we're going to be wrong. So let's go ahead and jump into this review.
Hey, buddy, watch this.
So next up here is Shondo Wildclaw, dual class legendary for Hunter Druid, 3 mana 2/3, choose one, give beasts in your deck +1/+1, or transform into a copy of a friendly beast. So you've got kind of a Prince Keleseth on one half specific to beasts, or alternatively sort of a Prince Taldaram on the other half, also specific to beasts, combining those two Knights of the Frozen Throne cards in a weird way here. And I mean, yeah, I think both of those effects are potentially really powerful. You know that Prince Keleseth was a really powerful card. This comes down marginally later. It is specific to beasts, so you probably have to construct your deck in a way where you have enough beasts to make it compelling. I think in Hunter, though, that's not especially problematic. Like, yes, they've been dragon-driven for a while, so this might be limited in the short term if dragons are still the sort of dominant build around minion type for Hunter. But certainly after Descent of Dragons rotates, this card will still be around. This could be nuts there. Druid similarly doesn't always run a ton of beasts, but you know, there's winged guardians out there and a handful of different beasts in Druid. Fortunately, some of those are tucked behind choose one effects. So Druid also has a little bit of limitations. So I think the +1/+1 aspect is currently a little less compelling than the transform effect, which is crazy with things like King Crush off of a Dino Tamer brand. You get a 3 mana 8/8 with charge, or Winged Guardian in Druid, you get another gigantic taunt for only 3 mana. So there are definitely some ways to use the copy aspect. There's no doubt to me that the ceiling for this card, the peak of its power level, is absolutely absurd. There are, of course, still questions about the sort of consistency or the floor of it, because I don't think necessarily every deck wants to utilize this. It might have, you know, not enough beasts to make it exciting, or maybe the transform effect is limited as well. Like, you don't have enough big beasts or compelling beasts. But I think between all the death rattle beasts out there, just rush beasts, like just big stat beasts, it has to make sense. It's going to make its way into some decks. So I absolutely think Shondo Wildclaw is really, really good. It's not super obvious what deck plays it right now, but there's just too much upside here. There's too much power level. Something's going to make this work at some level or another. And, you know, maybe just Highlander Hunter right now is enough for that 3 mana 8/8 King Crush or whatever other beast is out there. So sure enough, I think this card is going to be great at some stage. You might not see it immediately, but there's a lot of powerful stuff going on here. Next up here is Rattle Gore, a legendary for Warrior. I freaking love the design of this card. It's a 9 mana 9/9 Death Rattle. Resummon this with -1/-1. So it dies, it becomes an 8/8. It dies, it becomes a 7/7. It dies, it becomes a 6/6. That is a ridiculous total amount of stats for 9 mana. I haven't done the math, but it's just totally obscene. And that's so cool. I love this like infinite recurring kind of card. I think that's really nice. Now, is it good is the question, right? Well, I mean, certainly you could imagine some scenarios where this is good. If you're playing a hyper late game deck and just having this body that keeps coming back, or alternatively, your opponent is not really rewarded to kill, so just gets to attack as a 9/9 all the time, taking tons of trades or pushing a lot of face damage. That's really cool. But unfortunately, I think the way Hearthstone plays today, that's so unlikely to ever work. This doesn't have taunt. It doesn't have any kind of immediate effect battle cry. So essentially, you just plop it on board and it sits there. How many Hearthstone games have you played where you can just play a 9 mana 9/9 that doesn't help you really swing the game in any significant way? I mean, there are worlds where like Ysera Unleash gets played, but that sacrifice you make is paid off in spades typically when you make a huge swing on the board later. This never really provides that swing. Of course, this is also super susceptible to silence and polymorph style effects. I know that's not typically something you love utilizing as a counterpoint to a card's strength, but when the card's entire strength is boiled into a single death rattle that's very easily countered, that becomes really relevant, right? So yeah, Rattle Gore, unfortunately, I love it, but I'm going to try my very best to make this card succeed. I just don't see how you can ever spend 9 mana. That said, if Warrior is able to utilize some effects that cheat minions into play, heavily discount minions, then yeah, cards like Rattle Gore might just work out. You might suddenly cheat it out for 5-6 mana, and it's, in a stage of the game where you can afford to take some time, afford to take a little tempo hit, and this just overwhelms opponents that don't run silence. But then again, if you get to a stage of that being a really popular meta relevant sort of thing, then decks will begin to tech against it. Decks that are strong against it will rise in power, and this will lose its strength again. So this is one of those cards that's like supremely fun, but probably average at best from a power level standpoint, and actually very likely to fail as far as I'm concerned from a power level standpoint. So unless this gets something super specific to help manipulate it onto board sooner, or, spam it or copy it or pull some ridiculous shenanigan that we can't anticipate, Rattle Gore is probably going to be pretty weak, but it has that just tiny glimmer of hope that it could see some crazy play if the stars align. Nature Studies here, one of the new studies cards. It's a 1-mana spell for Druid. Discover a spell, and your next one costs 1 less. So essentially here, a way to cycle into something you need, discover some removal, or discover a buff, or discover a Savage Roar without actually really sacrificing any mana cost or efficiency in the process, because the 1 mana that you spend on Nature Studies is immediately refunded. And what this means is, not only is that awesome for like discovering that super flexible tool you're looking for, but that combos really nicely with things like exotic mount sellers or any card that really wants you to play spells. So it just allows you to like chain stuff into your mount seller even more efficiently than before. So yeah, like the world we know right now with Spell Druid, Nature Study seems like it fits in really well. You play this cheap spell, you probably discover another cheap one. It might be a Power of the Wild that complements the game plan even more. And then even outside of that Spell Druid world that we know right now, in case that deck doesn't like stick around or doesn't remain super powerful, I think this still remains a really flexible tool for Druid, because we know that sometimes just discovering cards, this is that magic trick style of thing in Mage, but with a discount baked in, that seems really fantastic, and I could imagine a handful of different decks being able to utilize this successfully throughout the course of its standard format run. So Nature Studies just looks like one of those cards, it's not like crazy powerful, it's not going to inherently win games itself, but it just does what you like in Hearthstone very efficiently, and does what Druid likes as well, so I totally expect this card to see lots of play. Next up here we have Lightning Bloom, a dual class card for Shaman and Druid, and it's 0 mana, and it allows you to gain 2 mana crystals this turn only, with an overload of 2. So we got overload making its way into Druid, and we've basically got here an OG Innervate, 0 mana gain 2, but with that overload punish on a future turn. Now, as we know, OG Innervate was absolutely bonkers in so many different ways, allowing you to utilize that much mana in a single turn. Could do 2 things, basically, like late game combos became more possible because you could drop a Malygos and then Innervate into more mana to find damage, although Moonfire, sometimes the Druid make that unnecessary, but remember, this is a Shaman card as well. But also beyond that, you can just cheat out early game threats sooner, the old Innervate Yeti stuff that we used to see back in the day. But instead of a Yeti, it's going to be some other bonkers, crazy, powerful card in Hearthstone right now. So cards like this have that dual flexibility where they can be played in both ways really successfully. And frankly, Shaman and Druid are both classes that have that kind of combo damage potential. Shaman has a ton of burst damage spells. We've seen Malygos shenanigans in both of these classes before. So I think that's one angle of play for this, but also just cheating out big things early in the game. Now, the overload probably makes the cheating stuff out plan a little bit less compelling because you are going to pay that price. But in a combo world, you don't care about the overload because you're ending the game anyway. So this seems to open a lot of scary doors for both of these classes. Cards like this kind of make me nervous because of the ways that they can break the game. We know that mana cheat in Hearthstone can be problematic. It can be meta defining. So absolutely, I think this card looks great. I don't think the overload's enough to hold it back or punish it, because if you win the game with a really decisive big turn, it doesn't really matter what you do next turn anyway, right? Doesn't matter that the overload is there. So yeah, I'm super spooked by this card. I think it's going to be really, really good. Now let's take a look at the Colt Neophyte, a 2-mana 2/2 with a battle cry. Your opponent's spells cost 2 more next turn. So this is absolutely just a mini Lotheb. It is exactly the same as Lotheb in every way. Stats that are symmetrical to its cost and its effect. It's just, 3 mana less, 3/3 stats less, and a 3 mana less on the battle cry as well. So does that make this card any good? I think it does, actually. Yeah, I mean, Lotheb was certainly better, I think, because Lotheb's highest utility in many cases was really two things: shutting down combos and protecting big wide boards in the mid game if you're an aggro deck. So you play like 3 or 4 things. You want to protect your board from that, brawl, for instance. You drop Lotheb, the opponent can't cast Brawl on turn 5, you deal a ton of damage, you win the game. Colt Neophyte, I think, actually still retains a lot of that mid game utility, because usually you're dealing with pretty small margins when it comes to removing an early to mid game board. Brawl on 5, you don't have 7 mana, you have 5. And the Colt Neophyte can still shut down that Brawl on turn 5. Now, I think this is a little bit less valuable in the late game when there's more mana to spend, but it could also be more valuable in the super early game. If you get like a nice, 1-2-3 curve, or even just a really strong 1-2 curve, drop this on turn 3, stop whatever kind of spell was going to remove your kind of early game board. So it's in a lot of ways more flexible than Lotheb. It's just a question of, are those mana differences going to be tight enough that it still does what it needs to do. Whereas Lotheb, it's 5 mana punish. That's huge. You can almost play nothing, for instance. But Colt Neophyte doesn't have quite that same universality. So I think it'll still be relevant. I think it'll still be good. And it's cheaper to play, so you can do more with it. Like, you can drop Colt Neophyte and a kill command instead of just dropping Lotheb, for instance. So this card looks like it has a lot of utility. It's just, is it going to be worth running that slot, or would you rather just run a really powerful 2-drop, for instance? But as both a tech card, as an aggro protection tool, I could see a lot of decks utilizing this one pretty successfully. So I think Colt Neophyte's going to be a really solid card. The Frazzled Freshman here, a 1 mana, 1/4. I think I looked just like that at one point in my life. This is a minion that's just a pure stat bomb for Priest, enabling Priest to get off to some big shenanigans in the early game with tempo minions. We saw a lot of the Priest rework cards playing towards buffing health in Priest. Things like Coultier and Chaplain, that nice 2-drop follow-up, but Priest hasn't necessarily had a great 1-drop to build off of and use things like Inner Fire and use those health buffs to great effect, particularly with Divine Spirit leaving. But I think Frazzled Freshman gives it that great 1-drop start. We've seen like cards like Dire Mole just get played because sometimes you need an early game minion. Blazing Battle Mage is really the same kind of thing. And this shifts the stats around a little bit, and you get 5 total stats, which is really nice for a 1-drop. So even though this is textless and doesn't have an effect, I think there are still that occasional Tempo Priest deck that could use this. Now, Tempo Priest isn't something we've seen succeed yet, but it feels like a direction that Blizzard is pushing Priest. And if they do, I think this card absolutely makes sense for that deck. So, if you look at Hearthstone right now, is this card any good? Yeah, probably not, right? But if you think about the future and you think about the potential of the class, I think you can see some lines of play for this one. All right, Wretched Tudor, a 4 mana 2/5 with Spellburst, deal 2 damage to all other minions. So you drop your Wretched Tudor, you cast a spell, and you're dealing 2 to the board, including your own minions here. This is not just enemy minions. So, a card like this is pretty iffy to me. We've seen so many cards already that in the mid game deal 3 damage. Think about like those Dusk Breakers. Even your Crazed Netherwing in Warlock is dealing 3 at 5 mana instead. And 2 damage is just not quite as satisfying of a breakpoint. Like, yeah, it's good against Demon Hunters, but limited against maybe everything else. So I don't think that does enough. Plus, you have to cast a spell to activate this. So it's one of those things where it's like, do I really have the mana or time to do that? Now, it is kind of cool that you can bank that for the future. Like, you can slam this down and not activate it, and your opponent's like, oh god, if I play stuff, it's just going to die to the Wretched Tudor. That's a cool kind of high friction moment, but then you're giving all the power and control over how this card is utilized to your opponent in a lot of ways, because then just play stuff with like 3 health or 4 health, and they're like, okay, I don't care. I was going to play 2 2/2s, but now I'm going to play a 4/4 instead. And like, yeah, sure, this could still trade into the 4/4 in that case, but it's not a super exciting play, right? There's other things in Hearthstone that are way bigger and way cooler. So this feels a little bit directionless to me. I just don't think the numbers and the effect is big enough. I think the delay actually hurts more than it helps, although there is some debate there. So I don't know, these cards that are like tricky and sneaky and create friction in this particular way aren't usually successful, and I don't think this one's going to be particularly good either. Moving on here to the Wand Thief, a 1 mana 2/1 for Mage and Rogue. Nice dual class card here, moving combo into Mage, which is nice, and it allows you to discover a Mage spell. And this card looks nuts. I think this is awesome. Really flexible, low-cost things are fantastic for Rogue. We know that's a perfect idea for Rogue. Also, mage spells are probably good in Rogue too. They can get nice cheap spells, or sometimes big ones if they need to fill in some value. So that flexibility is really nice. Even secrets can work really well in Rogue now. So discovering a mage secret, which you're pretty likely to do on any occasion, that seems fantastic. And then in Mage, I mean, yeah, just having nice little minions to start out the game is cool. You may not play this on turn 1 very often because you might want to utilize the combo, but you might play it on turn 1 against certain decks if you know that you need those stats early. Otherwise, it's something you fill in the mid game, the late game. You got a spare mana laying around, which happens all the time, and you convert some stats on board into a card in hand, and often the card in hand is going to be pretty solid as well. So a nice way to get a really flexible card, fill in those mana gaps, put some stats in play, discover things. It just does everything you like in Hearthstone. So I absolutely think Rogue will love and adore this card in a lot of ways. I think Mage will find ways to use it as well. So Wand Thief looks like one of those really solid cards. It's not a game winner. It's not something you build your deck around, but it's really, really good. Moving on here to Devolving Missiles, a Shaman and Mage dual class card. 1 mana, shoot 3 missiles at random enemy minions that transform them into ones that cost 1 less. I think this is such a cool idea, combining Devolve and Arcane Missiles. That's so fun. Really neat design here. And as far as power level is concerned, I think this is a pretty interesting card on that front as well. Now, there's 2 ways to talk about this. Is it similar to Devolve, for instance? Devolve, denied your opponent's entire board. And something that's really cool if they have a lot of buffs or, spell effects or just really big minions that you're trying to turn into smaller stuff. Devolve can work great in those scenarios. So it was great against like Magnetic for, taking all those buff stats and turning them into something tiny. If you get into a world with like Librams, and that's crazy, Devolving Missiles would be great against that sort of play. Beyond that, this card does something a little different than Devolve. Devolve was great against wide boards. This card can be okay against kind of medium wide boards because 3 missiles could hit 3 different things. Or alternatively, your opponent has 1 really big thing. You can Devolving Missiles, and it's going to shoot the same minion 3 times based on my reading of this card, which means you'll devolve it from 3 mana, basically. So if it starts out at 8, you're going to push it down to 5, which can really reduce the power level of that thing on board. Now, that's pretty sweet. I think, clearly when this is generated off of random effects, whether that's, a card that's giving you 1 mana spells like your Cobalt Spellkin or just, Evocation and Mage, you're going to be really, really happy to see this card from time to time and be like, oh, this was perfect. This answered exactly what I needed. That's great. I turned their giant thing into something useless. The Death Rattle's gone. Whatever. Beyond that, though, does this make its way into decks? I wonder, and I'm concerned, the fact that it is random, the fact that it's not reliable and universal like Devolve in a lot of ways, that scares me. Plus, compared to something like a Polymorph or a Hex that both of these classes has access to, it does still leave stats on board, whereas Hex and Polymorph really reduce the stat line by from 10-10 to 1-1. This might reduce the stat line from 10-10 to 8-8, and that's not particularly significant. So I wonder if they actually ever run this card. I don't know if it makes the cut. Clearly, anytime you have something that rewards cheap spells, if that's like you're trying to get a Kael'thas activator or Gadgetzan Auctioneer or something like that, a card like this could work great. It's certainly fine in those worlds, but I bet most decks for both of these classes don't really make room for Devolving Missiles unless they have a specific low-cost spell synergy plan. So I bet this falls short a lot of the time, but who knows? It's good enough, perhaps, that it could get run. Here I got Transfer Student. I don't know what the heck this card's about. This is crazy. Transfer Student, 2 mana, 2/2. This has different effects based on which game board you're on. That is completely absurd. You guys are going to get this card for free. I don't know the effects, so I can't rate the power level of this card. My instincts are that they won't be particularly strong effects because that'd be crazy. And that means this won't be great, but, stay tuned. I also have no idea if this applies to wild and standard format, if it's like limited at a certain amount, or if it's coded for every single board in the game. I don't know. I love the fact that this card sort of twists how the game works. I think that's really cool that they're utilizing the digital space of Hearthstone in a cool, creative way. But as far as rating this card, time will tell. So next up here, let's talk about Goody Two Shields. Fantastic name and artwork and character here. She's actually got 2 shields. That's so cool. It's a 3 mana 4/2 Divine Shield. Spellburst, gain Divine Shield. So real quick, talking about the operations of this card, I don't know 100% how this is going to work. So just to clarify, if you have Divine Shield, you can't gain another Divine Shield. They don't stack or anything, of course. So I'm assuming if you play Goody Two Shields and then you cast a spell, it's going to try to activate the Spell Burst, and the Divine Shield will essentially fizzle, wasting your Spell Burst. There is a potential world where the Spell Burst doesn't activate, just kind of holds itself because it knows it can't give Divine Shield. I think that's very unlikely, though. So I'm assuming if you try to use this pre-Divine Shield popping, it's just not going to be that great. But there's still a lot of scenarios where this is crazy. First off, just a 4/2 with Divine Shield for 3 mana is kind of intriguing, particularly in a class with a lot of buffs like Paladin. Beyond that, it's creating a bit of a dilemma for your opponent, right? They kind of have to kill it. Otherwise, you're going to be able to utilize your Divine Shield to take a proactive trade when it comes back to you. That's really nice. Trade up for free, and then you'll probably be able to activate that Spell Burst to give it Divine Shield again, which is really cool. You're just getting a lot of potential trade value out of your Goody Two Shields. So they're kind of forced to deal with it right away. If they don't deal with it, I think this card has a lot of upside. There are some limitations because you do have to cast a spell if you want to play a minion instead. It's like, oh, you're really limiting your path in the future turns, but Blessing of Kings exists. The one other downside there is, though, if you wanted to use this with Blessing of Kings to trade it immediately as like an 8/6, you cast your Blessing of Kings and then you want to trade, but you're wasting the Spell Burst again. So you want to trade first and then cast Blessing of Kings, which means it can't really trade up all that effectively. So there's essentially, I know this is kind of confusing, but there's a lot to break down about the operations of this card, and certain scenarios are going to be great, certain scenarios are going to feel weird and awkward, and ultimately what that means is I think this card has a lot of good stuff happening. Divine Shield, stats, mana cost, all that's great. But I think the limitations of how all that pans out and the pure susceptibility of sort of a Divine Shield and 2 health minion in a world with a lot of lackeys and stuff, I think that's going to hold Goody Two Shields back a little bit too much. So let's take a look at Diligent Note Taker next, a 2 mana 2/3 for Shaman with Spell Burst. Return the spell to your hand. So you plop the Diligent Note Taker, you cast a Lava Burst, and you get another Lava Burst added to your hand, and boom, you get to deal a little bit of extra damage. So essentially, this is a 2 mana tax in a way to generate a spell in your deck. And spells in your deck are good. You run spells, you like spells. And that's a good return, I think, on your investment in many cases. It's kind of like 2 mana draw a card, but with a minion attached. And it's a specific card that you kind of control. Now, there is a limitation on the other side of that, is that you have to spend the 2 mana tax at a certain point if you want to get a specific spell back. So, maybe you don't really want to play the 2 mana 2/3 right now to get that spell, or maybe you have exactly 7 mana for your Earthquake, and it's like, oh man, I don't really want to wait another 2 mana to get the Diligent Note Taker down. So there are some restrictions there, and this probably works better with medium to low cost spells. So maybe it's more about the Far Sights of the world or Serpent Shrine Portals of the world to just help you keep refilling your hand while playing stats. So that's really the question for me with this card, is what deck runs it? Is it like something control decks use to get additional resources? Is it something, more mid-range or fast decks are willing to run because they like the 2/3 stat line okay, and it keeps them, kind of flowing as far as their hand is concerned? How much is the tax and awkwardness of having to squeeze this into a turn going to be a problem, or will it just naturally fit in where you have 2 spare mana anyway and you're happy to do it? I will say in Shaman, I often feel like I'm hitting the totem a lot anyway, and I didn't really have 2 mana to spend, so maybe Diligent Note Taker fits in just fine in this class. So all in all, a card with some real promise, and if there's a specific deck that needs 3 spells exactly, whether that's just lightning bolts to the face or more removal or some crazy shenanigan, this card opens up those possibilities, and it's really 4 because you can run 2 Diligent Note Takers in your deck as well. So all in all, I see some promise with this one. I don't think it goes into every Shaman deck or anything, but it certainly looks like a playable, pretty solid card. So here we have First Day of School, a new 0 mana spell for Paladin. Add 2 random 1-cost minions to your hand. So this is a card that can give you some early game resources to use. Unfortunately, I think 1-drops on average are pretty weak. You're going to get like really situational stuff. Very rarely you're going to get those really sticky, awesome 1-drops that you're excited about, or Blazing Battle Mages, or even your Libram card at 1 mana. But that's going to limit the utility for this, I think, just because, like, I don't know, I'd rather just maybe run a good one drop than run a card like this. That said, it is a 0-mana spell, so there are shenanigans possible. Things like Kael'thas open up with a card like this. Can also just increase the density of early game drops if running something like a token deck that just needs a lot of minions and doesn't care as much about card quality. So at first glance, I think this looks really weak. I just don't think it packs enough punch for the draw, and it doesn't really give you much return on running this card in your deck. But if there are enough synergies that can be explored, there's that little bit of hope for a card like this. Now, that said, this card has some pretty huge upsides, namely, it's random enemies, so this can actually go face. This can be 6 face damage on an empty board, which if you're ahead can be pretty cool. The minions can take trade, so they survive on board, and it's repeatable over multiple turns. So this card does actually do a handful of different things. It is 8 mana, which is pretty expensive. That gives me some hesitation. I don't ever think this replaces a Grom as a face damage tool. But in an arena card, this looks amazing. And constructed, I'd say it's a little bit more limited in its utility because of its high cost. I don't know exactly which deck wants to run this outside of maybe like in a Highlander deck. And certainly Highlander Warrior is possible, but it's not something we've seen succeed a ton without its own class-specific Highlander card. So Troublemaker looks cool. It's like a big value bomb. I'm sure you'll be happy to get it on occasion off of random effects, but I don't think this often makes the cut in actual deck lists. Nature Studies is a 4-star card. Lightning Bloom is a 5-star card. Colt Neophyte is a 4-star card. Frazzled Freshman is a 3-star card. Wretched Tudor is a 2-star card. Wand Thief is a 4-star card. Devolving Missiles is a 3-star card. Rattle Gore is a 3-star card. Goody Two Shields is a 3-star card. Diligent Note Taker is a 4-star card. Shondo Wild Claw is a 5-star card. Troublemaker is a 3-star card. First Day of School is a 2-star card. And there you go, folks. Our first card review for Scholomance Academy is done. That was a lot of cards to get through, but there's a lot more to come. So if you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to the channel. We'll be putting out card reviews as fast as humanly possible, like always, so you guys can see these cards, have a great spot to discuss what you think about all these. That said, please share your thoughts in the comments below. You guys are smart. You know what you're talking about. So what did you like? What did you hate? What was I wrong about? What was I wrong about? I meant to say right about, but hey, it's probably more likely that I was wrong about everything. So share those thoughts in the comments below. Thanks much for watching. Stay tuned for more Scholomance Academy stuff. And until next time, game on.